Shiona God, Osio, and hello everyone. Welcome to today's Listen, Lunch, and Learn at the Museum of the Cherokee People. I'm honored to join this esteemed group of panelists today as we discuss First America, a new podcast that examines the long histories of Native people during the Revolutionary era and up to our current moment. I'd like to start by asking each panelist to briefly introduce themselves. So, Rebecca, can we start with you?
Yeah, Osio Nagad, Gohin Dodon, Telekayedli, Gela, Telek, Oklahoma, Janelle. Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Nagle. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation and I live in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And for the purposes of today's panel, I am the host of a new podcast called First America, that really seeks to tell the true origin story of the United States in a way that also explains the current political moment that we're all living through.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Maggie, will you go next?
Sure. Bonjour, Maggie Blackhawk and Dijnakas. My name is Maggie Blackhawk. I'm Fond du Lac Vanda Ojibwe and the Moses H. Grossman Professor of Law at NYU Law School.
Thanks so much. And Joe,
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. I am an associate professor at George Mason University, just outside of Washington, D.C. And my work has focused on federal Indian policy and allotment. And more recently, public history. I have been working on a project at historic Fort Smith and more recently at the U.S. Capitol building. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that project maybe a little bit later.
I certainly hope so. And if everyone will indulge me for just a few minutes of introductory comments. My name is Brandon Dillard, and I am the Director of Historic Interpretation and Audience Engagement at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in Central Virginia. I'm also a citizen of Cherokee Nation. And I remember when I first started at Monticello, some of my friends and family asked me, why would you want to work at the home of Thomas Jefferson? That's a fair question. That's a tough question, and I'm going to give the same unsatisfactory answer that I always give. It's complicated. Thomas Jefferson wrote the American Declaration of Independence, which is the actual thing that turned 250 years old on July 4th. It's a document that is revered for its Enlightenment rhetoric. It's one that stands as an inspiration for rights-based democracies around the world. Thomas Jefferson wrote about freedom and equality, and Thomas Jefferson was an enslaver. He held more than 600 human beings in bondage throughout his life. He wrote about the evils of slavery. He wrote about Native people. He cataloged languages. He collected cultural artifacts and diplomatic gifts. He had them displayed in his home at Monticello to teach his visitors about the breadth of cultures across Native America. And he was instrumental in devising some of the first plans that would lead to native dispossession through removal policies in the 19th century. I believe that perhaps more than anywhere else in the country, Monticello can help us understand America. It can help us understand a nation that celebrates freedom and equality while denying it to so many. Jefferson understood that contradiction. He wrote about it. And Monticello, me and my colleagues, we don't shy away from sharing that complexity with our visitors. We lean in. For only by sharing honest and full histories can we understand our shared pasts. Rebecca Nagle's First America does exactly this, drawing explicit connections between the challenges of our history and the realities of our current struggles. And it's an honor to discuss this survey of Native history and how it impacts us today. Like many people, my family's personal history is marked by removal and disconnection. I don't speak for Cherokee people. I don't pretend to speak to Cherokee cultural knowledge. I wasn't enrolled until I was an adult. And my predominantly European ancestry means I have experienced the privileges of whiteness, a topic that Rebecca discusses eloquently in this podcast and elsewhere. But my family always maintained knowledge of who we are. And the Museum of the Cherokee People is a very special place to me because it provides an avenue for connection. I feel the same way about Cherokee cultural centers in Oklahoma. So when Shayna, the director of the museum, and her team invited me to help with an exhibit looking at the 250th anniversary of the American independence from a Cherokee perspective, I was honored, I was humbled, and I was a little scared that I might not have much to offer. I know I learned far more than I contributed. The story we set out to tell is a hard, emotional narrative that encourages people to think about resilience and choices in the face of adversity. All Cherokee people experienced the American Revolution. For people living in Cherokee communities across Cherokee country, the entirety of the 18th century was a century of conflict, and it was a time of great change as the processes of colonization brought disparate peoples together in often violent ways. Some European visitors, emissaries, and even immigrants came into Cherokee communities. In a multicultural world of Scottish traders, English scientists, Spanish diplomats, French hunters, they all intermingled with Cherokee people. But wave after wave of settlers from the east would continue to steal Cherokee lands, and the violence that erupted from these illegal incursions continued for decades. It culminated in war with the English in the 1760s, which was followed by war with the Americans, which broke out in 1776. Cherokees allied with the British during the Revolution in hopes that it might help protect their homes, their communities, and their culture. The American response, it was swift, it was horrifying, and settler armies destroyed entire towns, livestock, and crops with the stated purpose of killing men, women, and children. Actions which heighten the irony of Jefferson's claim of native savagery and warfare written in the Declaration. This war continued for nearly 20 years, and while many Cherokee leaders sued for peace in hopes of preserving life, others continued the fight, and military leaders like Dragon Canoe, Hanging Maw, Doublehead, and John Watts opposed American invasion by force. Women leaders, like ones known only to us today as Katuo or the beloved woman of Chota, shared political authority in a society without gendered hierarchies and publicly denounced the settler invasion in council and directly to the American leadership. Cherokee people defended their homes in different ways, choosing peace or war in hopes of preserving their ways of life. Dragon Canoe died undefeated in 1792, not in battle, but under circumstances that remain somewhat mysterious to this day. He remained unrelentingly defiant in the face of oppression until the end of his days, and he was recorded to have said, even on the field of destruction, "We are not yet conquered." In 1794, Cherokee signed the Treaty of Tellico Blockhouse, effectively ending military opposition. But in the decades that followed, Cherokees took on new strategies, defending their homeland in the courts. Life continued to change and new people moved into Cherokee lands, including enslaved Black Americans, some of whom were even enslaved by Cherokee owners. They too added their voices to calls for justice and equality promised in the Declaration and unrealized in their lives, promises not yet realized to this day. Today, the three federally recognized Cherokee tribes are comprised of 500,000 citizens across the world. We differ as much as any large group of people, with political opinions that range and interests in history and culture that varies. Some of us with mixed ancestry from all over the world, some of us distant from our Cherokee ancestors, and others closely connected to Cherokee communities, living entire lives deeply embedded in traditional culture. Many Cherokees of all kinds remain committed to preserving the sovereignty fought so dearly for by our ancestors. Each of us has an individual relationship with how we understand our history, and by sharing our thoughts and ideas with each other, like we're doing now, we grow and learn together. When we opened Unrelenting, Cherokee People in the American Revolution a few months ago at the Museum of the Cherokee People, I've never felt so honored to take part in something, and I hope my perspectives on late colonial and early Republic history and public memory helped in an effort so brilliantly led by the museum's exhibit curators, Dakota and Evan. Cherokee artists contributed their work, interpreting and reinterpreting this history from Cherokee perspectives. It is powerful and it is beautiful, and if you haven't had a chance to see it in person, I cannot stress enough how much you should visit. I like to think that it helps people better understand, both Cherokees and everyone else, the complicated world in which we find ourselves today, and to remember that this history, to borrow a phrase from Rebecca, it happened here. First America achieves exactly this same goal. It grounds us in place, examines the past so that we might understand the present, and ideally, it helps us reconsider the future. I hope everyone has had a chance to listen up to the most recent episode 3. We have a few topics to get us started with our panelists, so please feel free to submit your own questions online. There's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave time for those towards the end of the hour, and we'll start with our first question for the host of the podcast. So, Rebecca, you repeatedly discuss how Native histories inform our present moment. Can you speak for a few minutes about the motivation behind that and how you think this history can help us better understand where we are today? And you are muted at the moment, Rebecca.
There we go. Thank you. When I first set out to make this podcast, I thought I was just making a history podcast. You know, I talked to scholars like Maggie, I read books, I visited historic sites. And then this thing kept happening where I would be reporting on America's past, and then the same thing would happen in our present. And if I can just tell a quick story, one of those times I was visiting a historic fort in Minneapolis with a historian named Nick Estes. And he was telling me about the history of that fort in the 1860s, which was actually used as a concentration camp for Dakota people during the Dakota Wars. And that concentration camp was actually just one aspect of US policy that was striving to extremely violently force all Dakota people out of the state of Minnesota. And so we're there, we're touring the site, and that day, Nick got a call from his wife that ICE had just shot and killed someone. And it was the day that ICE killed Renee Good. And so I actually stayed in Minneapolis to report on what was happening. And the next day, I was back at Fort Snelling, the name of the fort, but I was at the sort of larger campus, not at the historic fort, but I was actually at a protest because where ICE is headquartered in Minneapolis is on this larger Fort Snelling campus, because it's still federal land. And it was federal land because it was once a military reservation. And so, what I saw in that moment was the US federal government doing the same thing, rounding people up, detaining people, literally at the same place. And I think, and a lot of this goes to Maggie's scholarship. We can think about the way that history repeats itself, but I think the big lesson that I've been learning as I've been digging into this history and seeing the ways that it echoes in our present is that it's not just happenstance, or it's not just an echo, but when we really look at what our government did to Native Americans, I think most often we tell that story about how it impacted us, right? About how it impacted our tribes, about how it impacted colonized people. But I think the big purpose of the podcast and really what we're trying to achieve is showing how it impacted the US government. It changed the structure of the US government. And some of those changes were really bad. Some of the things that our government did to Native people are really terrible, and we've never gone back and adjusted and edited it. And so I think that history explains a lot of what we're seeing today, which I'm sure we'll get into more as we get into the panel. But yeah, and I also just want to say thank you so much to the Museum of the Cherokee People for hosting this. It's so great. For me, it's like when you make a podcast and you put it out into the world, like you kind of are like, okay, well, I hope people are listening. So it's really nice to engage also just with other Cherokees and be in conversation and really see how folks in the community are sort of taking this information and thinking about it. So thank you so much to everyone at the Museum of the Cherokee People for helping organize this. It's really special.
Well, and for my part, thank you, Rebecca, for the work that you do. It's an honor to be on this panel and to listen to the podcast. I mean, I find myself just re-listening to it over and over. And you just set up Maggie's work pretty well. So I'm gonna jump to a question for Maggie here. And this is something that I think about, that you talk about during the podcast as well. You discuss the importance of recognizing the relationships between Native people and the U.S. government in terms of colonialism, right? Can you provide insights on how facing that reality can help us navigate the challenges of this relationship?
So, yes, and I think my answer to your question will build very heavily on what Rebecca so aptly described. But I'd like to begin also by thanking the museum and thanking the Eastern Band and Cherokee Nation for allowing an Ojibwe interloper into this conversation. But I think it ties into my answer to a degree. So we've often seen the infrastructure of Indian policy over Indians flattening Native people, Cherokee people, Ojibwe people, Navajo people, Pueblo people, Inuit people, into a group called Indians. And we've grown really comfortable with that unification under the term Indian. But I think that the word colonialism really grappling with that term, and I understand that it's a very faddish term. It's a very morally weighted term, especially these days, one that people have backed away from for a range of political reasons. I use that term because it's historically grounded. It is the term that people who were developing these policies and describing these areas of government called colonial administration and territorial administration from the very first days of the founding of the United States. And so the Northwest Territory was described as the first colony of the United States. And from there, colonial administration and territorial administration were terms that were used interchangeably to describe a form of government that was used over non-subject people, so people that were seen as never or not yet part of the polity, and to govern areas, jurisdictions, areas of land, as well as the people who lived there under different forms of government than would govern the metropole. So the US was a colony itself before the Revolution. It understood colonial government, it understood what it meant to be a colony of another metropolitan government, like the British government. And so it actually borrowed whole cloth the British colonial system and applied it to the Northwest Territory. So when I use the word colonialism, I truly do mean it in that broader sense. So, and why do I want to do this other than to capture the language of that period, both the 18th century, the 19th century, and frankly, well into the 20th century and into the mid 20th century? I use that term because I want to understand the broader relationship between sciences, between structures of government and histories, and to disambiguate it necessarily from Indian people as we've come to recognize it. We often see Indian policy, Indian government as siloed with respect to, quote, Indian people. In my work, I try to present the term Indian as a legal category. It's many things, but it's also a legal category like the term slave that could be used to, that was often attached to certain racialized peoples, but was moved to a degree. So you had enslaved Native people, you had enslaved Africans who were dispossessed and kidnapped and brought to the United States by force. Similarly, with the term Indian. So, for example, when the US invaded the Philippines and took it over in the late 19th century, they tried to apply the term Indian to the population there to be able to keep them under a form of colonial administration and to keep them in a non-subject status, to keep them out of birthright citizenship, for example. And so if we think about colonialism, it better describes our past. It brings Indian policy into a much larger historical, political, intellectual, philosophical framework. We can actually start to place it and to start to see connections with the Philippines, with Puerto Rico, where these forms of government were actually just transported and, of course, adapted, but also applied for example, to Louisiana, to bring it into, to have territorial administration, to make sure that this Francophone French colony would be able to bring itself into the constitutional structure of the United States before joining the Union. It also allows us to better see our present and to see these forms of government as ongoing. So we like to think about Indian policy as something separate. We like to think about the territories as something separate. And many people struggle to see, okay, what is the relationship between the United States and Native nations today? What's the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico today? You know, we have even government leaders struggling with that classification. To see these forms of government as colonial, we start to see it both as a historical project and as an ongoing project into the present. Not just in terms of, you know, we have buzzwords like settler colonialism, you know, there's this modifier there of, you know, when it comes to the government of Native nations, when it comes to the government of Puerto Rico, it's just colonialism. And we have these massive structures of government to do that. We have massive administrative agencies, current federal agencies that today apply to full titles of the US Code to intervene and structure the governments of non-subject peoples. To review constitutions and reject them for other people, to review tribal codes, to review the laws of Puerto Rico, to intervene in their government at any time, to reject the drafted Constitution of the US Virgin Islands, for example. We have these structures where we are running the other governments of these other people. And to see that as colonialism allows us to both better understand the past. It's situated within this global and also far more capacious US context, but also to better understand how it's still going in a different form today, even aside things like tribal sovereignty and self-determination and autonomy. We can do colonialism and do those things too because we've long done it. And so I think it's deeply clarifying if we can move past all the politics and the discomfort with that term and see the reason for capturing it in this context, and for being comfortable with having this broader framework. Because the reality is, these aspects of government that have been historically developed and were long stable in the US are still deeply affecting the US today. They were part of its past, part of its present. And if we don't tussle with them, they'll be part of its future also.
Thank you for that, Maggie. And I'm just going to underscore that we are in this weird political moment where conversations like this are just so divisive. And Joe, I'm watching you nod for a lot of Maggie's comments here, and thinking back to a quick conversation we had before we jumped on here. You've done a lot of work with sharing these really complicated histories with public audiences and helping others learn how to do the same. And I'm wondering if you could just talk for a minute about how public history and public memory intersects with some of what Maggie just talked about, this idea of Indianness and Native perspectives broadly. And then if you could share insights on how public history initiatives, which essentially a podcast like First Americans is, or First America is, and can help shift, broader cultural understanding.
Yeah, well, I hope I can do a few of those things. I'm not sure that I can, but I will try. First, I want to echo everybody and say thank you. Thank you to the Eastern Band. Thank you to the museum. Thank you to Shayna, and the staff there. And thank you to my panelists, for all of your work individually and for being here today. I really appreciate it. Um, as a non-native scholar of Indigenous history, I find myself in places where I'm asked to speak about things, and I know that my role is probably better off to listen. And so this is one of those spaces, and I understand that. And so I'm going to keep that in mind as I talk about some of my experiences and some of the teaching that I've been able to do. I want to start though with actually the words of Paul Chott Smith, who was one of the associate curators at the National Museum of the American Indian. He just retired about 6 months ago, but he was there from the founding of the museum. He was curator. He is a curator of modern art, but he's also a writer. He's Comanche, and he was part of the American Indian movement, which, by the way, also started in Minneapolis. These histories, these layered histories, right? Sorry, as a tangent completely, but from Fort Snelling, and the U.S. Dakota War to the creation of the American Indian movement as a response to police violence in the middle of the 20th century, to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter response to police violence in the later 21st century, to ICE in the present day. Like these things repeat, exactly as you're showing us in the podcast. But Paul wrote a book, called "Everything You Know About Indians Is Wrong," and in it, one of the chapters is called "Americans Without Tears," and he talks about an idea that is central to how I think about public history and approaching this history with people who don't think about it very often. And here's what he says. He presents this whole theory of his, and it's kind of tongue in cheek, but it's really powerful. I'm not going to talk about that part. But here's what he says, though. His theory argues that no reasonably sentient person of whatever background could seriously dispute the overwhelming evidence that Indians are at the very center of everything that happened in the Western Hemisphere, which technically speaking is half the world, over the past 5 centuries. And so that experience is at the heart of the history of everyone who lives here. That sounds like hyperbole, but it actually understates things. Contact between the two disconnected halves of the world 5 centuries ago changed the planet and created the world we live in today. So really, the Indian experience is at the heart of, or pretty damn close to, the history of everybody, period. Not just corn and potatoes, but the Atlantic slave trade, gold and silver, ideas, microbes, animals. Yet that can't possibly be true, because everything you learn teaches you that the Indian experience is a joke, a cartoon, a minor sideshow. The overwhelming message from schools, mass media, and conventional wisdom says that Indians might be interesting, even profound, but never important. We are never allowed to be significant in explaining how the world ended up the way it did. In the final analysis, Indians are unimportant and not a subject for serious people. So these are powerful words from Paul, but I think that it gets at a really important um, issue, and that is that people, in the generally speaking, don't confront these issues that are surrounding us. And the thing that strikes me, and the thing that has come through Rebecca in the podcast, and the thing that I think about all the time is I hear you and other people that you're interviewing on the podcast using words like ignore, uh, that this history is hidden, ignored, hiding in plain sight. All like there's a whole language, but I feel like none of those words actually describe what's happening. And the word that does it best for me is disavowal, because it's all around us. And this isn't about me, but I'm working in the Capitol building, and when I walk in the Capitol building, I am surrounded by imagery of indigenous peoples that has been put up on the walls over the course of hundreds of years. There's nothing hidden about it. Like it's the opposite of hidden. It's all over the walls. It's written in the stone of the building. This is a disavowed history. This is not an ignored history. It's not a forgotten history. It's not an unknown history. We know this history. But I think that it's to me, there's a thing that happens about meeting people where they are, and trying to bring people along. Later in the same article, Paul says that the big goal for us, the big project, isn't to reverse all of our dichotomies. It isn't to make all of the bad guys good and all of the good guys bad, because that narrative has all the same problems that our current like meta narratives of US history have. But what our goal should be is to look with new eyes and new questions about this history that's surrounding us. At one point, Rebecca, I can't remember if it was in episode 1 or 3, but you're looking for a marker. I think it was actually episode 1, and you find it at Fort Snelling. It's under like an overpass or something, and you even asked Nick, like, do you think that people who are coming here are thinking about any of this history? And he says, no, I think they're doing winter sports, right? And that like that's it. That's it. People are not thinking about this history, but it's not marked, even if it's marked in a under an underpass or whatever. And there are certainly places where it's marked much more prevalently, but it is there. And I think to me, like making that meaning and finding a way to like combat that disavowal, to me is the work of public history and the work of something like your podcast to bring these ideas that people don't think about to them in a way that is digestible. And I think that's what makes it so important.
Could I just respond really quickly to Joe? Because I think he made a really important point about this disavowal, um, and about the resurgence in the presentation of this history. It's interesting for me as a legal scholar particularly of constitutional law, because there's a way in which the history is disavowed until it's not, until it's useful. So I think the paradigmatic example right now is the defense of the executive order purporting to strip birthright citizenship from children born to temporarily documented and non-documented parents. And the example of Native people being excluded from constitutional birthright citizenship wasn't disavowed, it was wholly embraced. And it was used by the government as their primary example to argue for constitutional precedent to also take that same category, that same Indian framework, and apply it to another group of people today. And if you look at US history, this has happened over and over and over again. The same frameworks that were applied on Indian reservations to build detention camps and legal infrastructures for Native people were also applied to Japanese Americans those who were incarcerated in concentration camps, some of them on Indian reservations during World War II. We can just think of all of these examples of it's disavowed until it's not used, it's not disavowed to be used as precedent. And I think that also it gives us a space to think about how particularly ominous it is for the general public to disavow this history while the government continues to avow it, and to not only avow it, but to use it as justification for the current structures of government that we have and to build new ones and to apply them to new and different populations outside of what we think of as traditional Indian frameworks. And so um, I think the dichotomy is helpful to really place against itself. It's not just a public history project. This really is a project of really understanding our current government and preventing a particular future that we've been on a certain trajectory for a very long time.
Yeah. And if
Just
I
adds.
can piggyback on that too. But what I was going to say in response to both of those things is that I think that that dichotomy of the government using what it did to Native people to justify actions today and the public not being aware, I think it's a very dangerous combination. So I feel like in the past year, what I keep hearing, I heard this about Minneapolis, right? So during the ice surge in Minneapolis, people said, politicians particularly said, this is un-American, this is un-American, this is unprecedented. Um, and it's not, rounding people up and putting them in detention is actually something that our government has done not once, not twice, but many times before. Even killing people who get in the way and resist is something that our government has done before. And so I think there's a knee-jerk reaction happening right now that what we're seeing is something other than, the values of our country, the democratic values of our country. It goes against the founding. You have things like the No Kings protests. Um, but that response actually it covers up the origins of our current political crises. And so I think that, yeah, I appreciate both those points together because I think it's really one of the things that the podcast is really kind of striving to push back against. Yeah, well, yeah, this has been such an exciting conversation.
I was just going to piggyback and add on, Maggie, to your point, one other example. There's a good book called Remembering the Modoc War, in which Boyd Cothran found that the justification used by the military in the Modoc War was then sort of unearthed and used in the War on Terror as a way of, justifying combat against non-combatants, essentially.
And torture, and specifically torture during the Bush administration. So, our next episode, not to give too much away, but the episode that drops next Monday is actually about the US military and how early wars with indigenous nations are kind of why we even have like a big central military that wasn't the founding vision. And also why the president can fight wars without congressional oversight and congressional approval. And so we visit with leaders from the Miami Nation and learn about the Tuawa-Sipiwe Alliance and this long war that really reshaped the US military. And, when we're thinking about current events like the war with Iran and things like that, so much of that is shaped by this early history. Now we're going to actually give it back over to
Which, funnily enough, I'm going to say two things. One for the panelists, don't stop doing that. Talk to each other. That's good for everyone. And then to the audience, also bear in mind that we do want your questions as well. So just, type things into the Q&A at the bottom and we'll do our best to answer them. Um, and I'll throw my perspective into some of what you just talked about, which I'll say when I was listening to some of the conversation about, most Americans have no idea that these words, merciless Indian savages, are written into the Declaration of Independence. And, why don't we know that? Why aren't we taught that? And it's two lessons. One for me is I spend way too much time thinking about and talking about this stuff because my immediate thought was like, well, I know about that and I talk about that. But I think there's a reality here, which is that a lot of Native people know about it, talk about it, wear T-shirts with the words on it, right? Because it's like a way of responding to it. And there's another piece of like what is public memory and what do Americans broadly actually pay attention to? I mean, we're living in this fun 250th moment, and I'm not making fun of people, but it is pretty awesome that I keep seeing these t-shirts with an American flag and 1776 and we the people, which is a clause that wasn't written in 1776. It was a clause that was written in the Constitution. And just knowing that most Americans, actually, many Americans don't know, and there are polls that show this, what the 250th is commemorating. They conflate the Constitution and the Declaration. So when we have these conversations about Native history, it's a broad reminder of what Native history looks like and how it intersects with American history. And one of the things that I applaud you for, Rebecca, is drawing that clause from the root to something that all of your listeners will understand. So if you could just take a few minutes to talk about the clause itself, why it was used, and why you focused in on it for this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, with the Declaration of Independence, the parts that we all know are the parts we learned in school: all men are created equal, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But that's just kind of the introduction to the Declaration of Independence. And when you read the document, it's actually a list of grievances. And so the founders are at war with England, and they're listing out the reasons that they're at war to kind of justify their actions, but also to inspire colonists to take up arms. They need regular people to pick up a gun and fight to win this thing. And so that's really the real purpose of the Declaration of Independence. And a lot of historians think that this list of everything that England has done wrong, a lot of historians think that that list has an order and that it starts with smaller things and that it crescendos to the biggest complaint. And the line about merciless Indian savages is the 27th complaint and the last complaint. So a lot of historians think that this was actually the big thing, the most important thing. And so it's kind of ironic or baffling that it's been so thoroughly scrubbed from the way that we talk about the history, because it's not like you have to like go through Thomas Jefferson's personal papers to find out that anger towards indigenous people helped motivate the founders towards revolution. They put it right there in our country's most famous document and one of the most famous documents in all of human history. So it's kind of baffling that we all don't know about it. But what I'd like to do too is explain why that line is there, because it's important. It's not a throwaway line. And what part of the dynamics of leading up to the revolution is that colonists wanted to expand. They wanted to take more land. They wanted to take more land from tribes and have more land for themselves. And the King of England was telling them no. And what had happened was that an indigenous uprising, basically led by an Odawa chief named Pontiac, had sacked a bunch of British forts. And so England's control over kind of like the Great Lakes region, but a huge swath of land in North America was very precarious. The crown was broke, part of the reason why, we famously got taxes of the colonies and couldn't afford to fight another war. And so England decides that it's going to make peace with indigenous leaders. And part of that peace was basically drawing a line down the Appalachian Mountains and saying, colonists, you're not allowed to move west of this line. And so that angered colonists. It angered colonists so much that years before you get rebellious acts like the Boston Tea Party or even the Boston Massacre or the Shot Heard Round the World, there are backcountry militias who are attacking British troops who are going to trade with tribes because they don't want those troops. They don't want they don't want England to have diplomatic relationships with tribes that the colonists see as their enemies. And so we tell the story of the revolution that it was fought over taxation and representation. But one of the main drivers for the revolution itself was hunger for indigenous land. And this is in the first episode of the podcast. It also largely comes from the work of Maggie's husband, Ned Blackhawk. And if you want to learn more about it, another great place is to check out his book, The Rediscovery of America.
Uh, so One of the things you just said there, Rebecca, that I think is so true is like this is one of the most famous documents in the world, right? Like people do know it, and all the politicization and the way that people talk about it aside, like people are familiar with these opening words about Enlightenment rights-based rhetoric, right? Um, Maggie. So many people were left out of that in the founding era, right? Women, Native people, enslaved and free Black people, people of color broadly, those without property, right? I mean, this list goes on. It's a very small group of people. And in the succeeding generations, many people have fought to try and achieve equality under the law. That fight continues today. Um, I've read some of your work about this previously, but I'm curious if you could talk for a minute about some of the ways in which marginalized people have used and subverted the rhetoric of the founding documents in their own calls for liberty.
No, thank you, Brandon. I wanted to return to something that you mentioned earlier about the t-shirts that had both the Constitution and the Declaration on them. So not only do we conflate often in commemorating 1776, but even when we get to 1789 and we start to celebrate the Constitution, we often conflate the Revolution, the Constitution with the establishment of a modern nation state that exists from sea to shining sea. And so those t-shirts probably have all the states, all the stars, this the map that of the lower 48 at the very least that we hold so dear. But we've forgotten that when the revolution occurred, and even by 1789, the United States was an experiment clinging to the Eastern Seaboard. When you have the centennial celebration 100 years later, it really is a celebration of an expansion. They've talked about how they go from this experiment to a nation from sea to shining sea. And even then, it's a bit of a fiction because you have massive parts of the United States that are still territorial governments. It's more imperial than it is this homogenized nation state with everybody speaking the same language, educated in the same schools, either secular or secularized in a particular way. And so we conflate this nation state. So not only do we disavow Native people and Indians, even though these words are in all of our founding documents, Declaration, Constitution notwithstanding, we also disavow expansion as a form of our constitutional history and as a central part of our own national history. Because the reality is, it takes a massive amount of work to get from this to that. And it takes work from people on the ground. So when you look at these petitions, so I study the history of petitioning, I study the history of petitioning, particularly in Congress, but I've looked at petitions more broadly, particularly by those who were at the margins, because petitioning was open to everyone, women, children, Native peoples, free Black Americans, some enslaved peoples, the foreign-born, even children. They all petitioned and were seen as legitimate petitioners that were treated on equal footing to others. So you can see from the very beginning how petitioners at the margins, both in terms of who would be included in the polity, but also even when it comes to space, maps of expansion, people who were claiming the United States and people who were disclaiming the United States. So Native people arrived very quickly and said, like you, we are independent. We are a non conquered people. We're going to use your Declaration of Independence as precedent for our own Declaration of Independence as well, and to claim our own distinctive sovereignty. And we're going to use the Declaration not as a rhetorical device, but as a legal device under the law of nations that it was seen as at the time. And so we get to see from their perspective the legality of the Declaration. In my field of constitutional law and theory, we don't know what the Declaration is. It's not a constitution. It's sort of seen as like the Hail Mary of constitutional law. It's the thing that we throw when you can't do anything else, when you actually don't have any law there. But these people at the time saw the Declaration as law and as fundamental law, perhaps even more fundamental law, because it delved into the law of nations in a way that the Constitution didn't. And so rather than fighting for, quote, rights necessarily or equality necessarily, we need to see expansion in that mechanism. They were actually saying, hey, we are going to be independent. We're going to limit your jurisdiction of your nation state. And because we're going to say we are not going to claim you. Whereas you had also people on the margins, especially free Black Americans, who were petitioning very quickly saying, we want to claim you. You can have jurisdiction over our community. And it allowed the US to expand rather than we're going to go to the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, we're going to go to some other place or even call for independence the same way Native people are doing. And it forced the US to stay true to the principles that it promised for all governments within the Declaration, because the Declaration, it doesn't actually start with those lofty principles of, all men are created equal. It actually starts with this is the standard for a government. And we get to claim independence because we're adhering to these principles in the first instance. And so the people who were allowed, who wanted the US to claim them, said, well, you can claim us, but you need to adhere to these principles. Whereas Native people said, no, we have our own principles. Equality of what? We often see equality. The US Virgin Islands today has no constitution. They don't have delightful forms of self-determination the way other territories and colonies of the US has. This is home to Epstein Island. This is not a great jurisdiction. They don't have a constitution because the US Congress rejected their draft constitutions for violating the equality principles of the United States. You can start to understand where you say equality of what? If you force equality on Canada, you will override their constitutional framework. And so it's not as though people don't like equality or liberalism within these separate jurisdictions. They just want their equality of what? Like, we want to have our own separate governments, our own separate visions of constitutionalism. And equality is a way of overriding that, and imposing the rights of other polities is a way of overriding that. And so they're trying to stop it by declaring their own independence. And you can see these legal mechanisms, and through it, the legal mechanisms of expansion and the way individuals use those legal mechanisms through the petitions of people on the margins. Once we unearth them and take them seriously, and they're everywhere once you unearth them and take them seriously. And they're very valuable to see the political, legal, and other intellectual philosophies of these people on the margins quite clearly. They're argued very, very well. So thanks for the question.
I appreciate all of that. And again, I want to underscore that, like, I'm not making fun of people for wearing like a confusing t-shirt. Like, everything you just said is super complicated, right? And and I say this respectfully and with as much adoration as I can possibly muster for all of you. This is a collection of a special group of nerds. Like, we spend a lot of time focused on thinking about stuff that the average person does not. And we dig into it in ways that most people don't. And that doesn't mean that people who don't care about history are stupid. I mean, you could literally be a rocket scientist, you could be a mathematician, you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about legal theory, right? So I'm gonna pitch this one to you, Joe. As we think about these complicated, messy subjects, how do we, as educators, professors like yourself, people working in public history, how do we help audiences make sense of all of that?
Yeah, I want to pick up on a few points that Rebecca and Maggie have both made, and then I'll try to be really brief if I can, because I know we've got a lot of questions and we're starting to run short on time. Um, Rebecca brought up the significance of land speculation and Western designs on Western expansion on Indian lands in the 1760s, and from Ned's work. I'll be teaching the early U.S. History Survey again this fall, and I spend 3 weeks explaining how the proclamation line comes into being, why it's significant, and how what the Ohio Company is, and what all of these folks are trying to do, and how they're pinning their entire futures and fortunes. These are the wealthy elite colonists, right? And then at the midterm, I ask, explain the coming of the American Revolution. And without a doubt, 95% of them tell me about no taxation without representation because it rhymes and it's short and they remember it. And maybe I'll get something about the Royal Proclamation, but they've heard no taxation without representation 1,000 times or more by the time they get to my classroom and they're 19 years old or whatever. And it's really, really hard to counter that narrative with something that more accurately reflects what was going on. And so I think that's really hard. But to go to Maggie's point about setting the scene at the American Revolution or immediately afterwards, the 13 British colonies are surrounded by massive indigenous confederacies and nations, right? So the Southeastern Confederacies and the Haudenosaunee in the Northeast, and these groups had, it had turned the tables or had been like the deciding factor in battles prior to the Revolution and during the Revolution. Spain, France, England, all of those places are important diplomatically to the new United States. All of these indigenous nations are way more important. And the reason that we know this is because they're rolling out the red carpet to Alexander McGillivray. They're rolling out these sort of diplomatic moments in New York City and Philadelphia and then Washington, D.C. The young United States learns how to do diplomacy through its interactions with indigenous diplomats. It sets the it sets the table, it sets the stage, it sets things in motion. Exactly what Maggie's talking about. If we look at all of these various kinds of territorial annexations all I don't have a good word for this, um, but one way to sort of break down this disavowal that we've been talking about is by saying like well, the founders clearly thought that these groups of people, these nations, these confederacies were hugely significant to the future of the thing that they were trying to do, this project, and shape in very dramatic ways the all of the mechanisms of government and law that we are now dealing with today. I mean, we could go to the Supreme Court to look at like the Marshall Court and the Marshall cases, which again sort of like the United States legal system learns how to be a legal system through its engagement with treaties and tribes. And so I'm working on this thing at the Capitol building, and it's in Congress's own museum, so it's supposed to tell the story of Congress, but I'm trying to explain to the people there that the story of Congress, if we really want to tell this story with indigenous diplomacy, is how Congress learned how to be Congress. And again, like that, fast forward 200 years, and this is where we are. Like from those auspicious beginnings, and I'm saying that facetiously, set a series of things in motion that it's not a direct line, but it creates the foundation that the modern Congress is built on.
Thank you
I
so
thought
much.
I'd offer a tagline. So no taxation with representation. We need an alternate. So no independent U.S. nation without the royal proclamation. What do you think? No? Okay. I at least get Rebecca laughing.
So,
Okay, sorry.
I love it, Maggie. I'll buy the t-shirt. So I will say for the last few minutes, we've got, a number of questions in the thread. I'm gonna try and combine some of them together as best I can. And a couple of them are talking about the specifics of Cherokee history. And one of the things, Rebecca, when I listened to this episode, it happened here, you open with, this conversation about removal, and then you have this conversation with somebody who's talking about the Haudenosaunee and the divisions that emerged during the Revolution. Those same divisions emerged among the Cherokee, right? That there were a lot of different approaches to how Cherokee people should respond to this war. And again, this is 20 years of people making different choices over time and the responses to it. This falls into, again, how these things are commemorated. You can drive along Western North Carolina and see roadside markers that talk about the Rutherford Trace, which is the expedition where American military came in and committed just as horrifying and horrible war crimes as those you describe in the podcast against the Haudenosaunee. So I just open this to the panelists. Some Cherokees chose peace, some chose war. In the exhibit, Unrelenting at the museum, we focused on dragging canoe. We focused on, older. There's this whole conversation about how there's a generational thing. It's way more complicated than that, but you've got different people choosing different paths. And could you just share your thoughts on how different Cherokees responded in the moment?
Yeah, yeah. The furthest back I can trace my Cherokee family is to the Revolutionary War era. And they lived in Hiawassee, which I visited. We didn't include it in the podcast, but I visited it while we were reporting on it. And it's this beautiful place. It's this wide river valley, and you can see the Appalachian Mountains, the ridgeline. And during the Revolutionary War, colonial militias burned Hiawassee to the ground. The fire was so hot that glass beads fused together. And my specific relatives, my family escaped in a dugout canoe. And so when I think about the birth of the United States, I think of my ancestors living literally as refugees, as many Cherokees were at that time. About half of Cherokee towns were leveled. Um, and one thing we talk about in the podcast is we talk about it more specifically with the story of the Miamia, but I think a lot of Indigenous nations share a similar history where there's a moment where there's divisions around whether or not armed resistance is the best tactic. And so you start to see those changes and those conflicts within Cherokee Nation in the late 1700s. As you mentioned earlier, by the end of the 1700s, we're no longer using armed resistance, and we really instead turn to diplomacy. I think that's the part of the history a lot of Cherokees know is sort of, Georgia versus Cherokee Nation, Worcester v. Georgia, like that kind of history. But what comes before that is actually like a century, like literally like 100 years of armed conflict, and people are paying the price of total war. Because it's not just the way that first the colonial militias and then later the US government, the way that they conduct warfare is not, soldiers meeting on a battlefield and like the best army wins. It's really total war, and it's this destruction of civilian infrastructure, and it's really collective punishment so that societies come to know that the cost of war is too high. It's really trying to, when we talk about Sullivan's campaign in the podcast, but Washington, if you read George Washington's letter to his general that then goes out and leads this campaign against the Haudenosaunee, I mean, it's destroy the crops that are in the ground, make sure that they can't be replanted. It's really this goal of making the people starve. And so, yeah, I think that when we think about Cherokees, by the time of the American Revolution, they've been through really since the 1690s and the indigenous slave trade, 100 years of armed conflict. The French and Indian War was extremely devastating for Cherokees. And so some people are choosing peace and some people are choosing armed conflict still. And I think you see those divisions in a lot of tribes. And I think I think we tell the story. I think I think a lot of times as indigenous people, I think we don't totally buy into this, but I think the popular version is that, either like Europeans had guns or they had better technology, or indigenous people, it's almost like we didn't know what was coming, and if we had known what was coming, we would have fought harder. And I think that those narratives let us not talk about how extreme the violence was. And I think for even our ancestors who chose to put down arms or side with the Americans, those were hard decisions that I think that they weren't making because they wanted to do those things, but because they were thinking about their own survival and the survival of their children and future generations of Cherokees.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think that complexity is such an important piece. I will say, completely unsurprisingly, we're about at time. This conversation flew by. But I do want to end on one kind of big idea. Everything you just talked about, this is such a hard history. It's a hard period to look at. And it's also a way that we can draw strength from the resilience of our ancestors, the choices they made to make sure that we are here today to still have this conversation, right? And that's something that I draw strength from. We are living in such a crazy moment, and it's not the first, it's not the worst, it's just a crazy moment. But people are trying to actively silence conversations about hard histories, while at the same time, we are having conversations about decolonizing our history. I just want to end with this. Where do you draw hope? Where do you draw inspiration? How do you continue the work? And that's for each of you.
I guess I could start. Not to put too much, this is going to sound a bit canned because we're, of course, promoting a podcast, but I think there's hope in the sense that I think more and more people are seeing the connections between our current moment of hard constitutionalism, hard government, of not actually understanding that the tools that we have in these myths that we tell ourselves about ourselves and our own history, our own constitution, our own constitutional history, they aren't solving the problems that we have in front of us. More and more, they're seemingly coming up short. Um, and so, in a certain sense, it's a ripe opportunity to start to see the connections between the structures of government we have that we're finally realizing are still there and the histories that built these structures of government, that built this constitutionalism, that built the problems that we face now with a very, very strong executive, with a very, very weak Congress, with a potentially overly strong Supreme Court, and also, I think, frankly, a massive administrative branch that doesn't necessarily have the right checks and balances in it because it was born within these colonial and territorial contexts and really moved between domestic and colonial without a lot of disambiguation during the progressive era. And I do think that these histories and tussling with the really deep constitutional problems of the past is less about guilt. It's less about finding a group of people to blame historically and today and saying, yes, Indians today are moral people and non-Indians are immoral people. Look at their ancestors. We are all, tussling with the same government on the same homelands at this moment. And I think these histories, looking realistically at our own government in the past without partisan politics, allows us to see how many people on many sides are right about their concerns about different things. And it gives us a different set of solutions and a different set of instances. It broadens our political horizons as to what our government has been and has done, what it's capable of, and what good limitations might be for that government moving forward. And ones that tussle with the concerns about the administrative branch, ones that tussle with the concerns about the president without checks and balances, with a federal system which has a very strong centralized federal power. These conversations should resonate with people, I think, all over the spectrum, if we choose to look back at our history honestly on both sides. And I don't necessarily see that as something that's cross partisan, but I hope we can inspire that by having these conversations and seeing, not a moment of guilt or of shame, but as a moment of deep introspection, so we can see the ways in which our values, which I think are there, can actually start to better match our present and our future with that.
Mhm.
Thank you, Maggie. Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, I would just like to say two things. But that's probably gonna end up being like 11 things. So first, personally, hope for me, I am in the privileged position of getting to work with young people every day. And the group of young people that I work with is pretty self-selecting. They have to sign up for classes in Indigenous history or museums and things like that. So it's fairly self-selecting, but it is very heartening to get to work with young people who are open to understanding these things. Um, Secondly, I think that at many moments in United States history, there have been opportunities where, or developments where, like, things that seem like a flaw in the system are exposed as being not a bug in the system, but actually how the system was created to work. And there's a backlash. And I hope, I'm hopeful. I often refer in like day-to-day talking to people, I refer to what about some point in the near future, I hope that future historians will call the backlash to our current moment. Like when people recognize like the state overreach is not actually something that is just indicative of now, but something that is indicative of the system that has been created. And hopefully that affects change. Um, uh, oh my gosh, there was another point that I wanted to make, and I'm blanking on it now. Oh my gosh, it was something directly to what you were going to say, Maggie. But I will leave it there with those two things. And Rebecca, turn it over to you.
Yeah. You know, I think I find a lot of hope in the history. You know, if we think of the present rise in authoritarianism, if we think of, and I've learned this from Maggie's scholarship in particular, if we think of authoritarianism just as government that isn't responsive to the people that it governs, that governs through force, that's top down. As Indigenous people, we've been dealing with those forms of government for a really long time, right? Like for literally centuries. And our ancestors, we didn't defeat colonialism, we didn't end it. We won some battles, we lost some other things, but I would say that we've been able to protect the things that are the most important to us, whether it's our languages or our children or our families or our own self-governance. And no matter what the present moment or the future holds, as Indigenous people, we will continue to do those things. And that we have kind of a deep knowledge of how to, in times of crisis, in times that are hard, protect the things that are really important. We know how to do that as Indigenous people. And so I think in learning through this, in learning about these chapters of history that are really hard to learn about, that are extremely violent. I think one of the lessons that I'm taking away from that history too is just about the resilience of our ancestors and how we can use that as a model for today.
Thank you for
Oh,
that final thought,
sorry,
Rebecca. Joe, go
sorry,
ahead.
Brandon. I remembered it was related to Maggie's point about guilt. And something that I talk with my students about is that guilt is a selfish emotion, right? Groups of people don't necessarily feel guilt. Individuals feel guilt. The way you say it is, I feel guilty, right? Guilt is oftentimes a roadblock to understanding as well. And as to go back to Paul Trot Smith's point, the history is all around us. This is a shared history. Um, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And again, thank you to each of you. This was wonderful. Again, I'm honored and humbled to be here. Thank you to the Museum of the Cherokee People for inviting me to come back and work with you again. I'm so appreciative of that. And thank you to the audience who tuned in with us today. Follow the Museum of the Cherokee People online, follow social media accounts so that you can stay apprised of the work that's ongoing there and future events at motcp.org. Again, it was a great honor, a great pleasure. I look so forward to listening to the rest of the podcast, Rebecca, and thank you all for joining us today. Wado, Shki, thank you.
But